Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 105, H B Raingill. Alfred Henry Bisset Raingill was born in Manchester, Lancashire, England in 1847 to Robert Henry Raingill, a clerk, and Elizabeth Mary Bates. He was the second child of 5 children. He had an older sibling, Louisa Ellen, and younger siblings, Matilda Jane, Sydney George, and Jessie Mary. Sydney George had come out to Australia and died in Swan Hill, Victoria on the 5th of May 1893 at the age of only 38. He'd only been in Swan Hill for 6 months and was a painter. His inquest stated that he had no friends or relatives in the colony, and the policeman was the informant, and he knew of him as a sober and industrious man, but he was destitute at the time of his death, and the inquest found that he died of a heart attack. He did, however, have a sibling, Alfred, who lived in Australia, and this is his story. On the 28th of July 1868, Alfred was jailed in Manchester for a total of 15 months for burglary. In 1871, he was jailed in Gillingham, Kent, at the age of 23, and he stated he was a clerk. He arrived in Melbourne on the Lammermoor from Liverpool on the 10th of June 1879 and stated his occupation as a smith on his immigrant record. He had 2 aliases, George Shaw and Joseph Yates. He is listed as being in Hay, New South Wales, under his birth name, Alfred Raingill, a month after his arrival. So it states on the 12th of July 1879 in the Hay Riverine Grazier. Hay Police Court. A man named John Smith was brought up in custody, charged with stealing a swag, the property of his mate, Alfred Raingill. Evidence of the apprehension of the prisoner has been taken. Alfred Raingill described himself as a shoemaker who recently arrived from Manchester, England, and he gave evidence to the effect that he fell in with the prisoner on the road to Hay. The prisoner represented that he knew the district well and offered to assist him in obtaining work, and they tramped on together. On coming to Hay, they stopped at Bent's Courthouse Hotel for a few hours. The witness fell asleep, and when he awoke, he missed his revolver, his swag, and his purse containing £13 in sovereigns. Other witnesses gave evidence to the effect that suspicion rested on the prisoner and that the stolen articles were found on him, but not the money. The prisoner was committed for trial. He was charged with larceny on the 12th of September 1879 at the Brighton Petty Sessions Court in Victoria, and he received 12 months hard labour under one of his aliases, Joseph Yates. On his Victorian court record, it stated that he was born in 1851 in Sydney, and he was a bootmaker. It also stated that he came overland to Victoria 8 years ago, single, no relations in the colony, parents dead, has 1 brother, cannot say where he is. So he was placed in Pentridge in June 1880. Information is requested of Alfred H B Raingill, who arrived in Melbourne on the ship Lammermoor about June last. He's a shoemaker, 30 years of age, 5'9", dark hair, beard, whiskers and moustache. And then in 1881, Alfred H B Raingill, an absconding witness from Hay, New South Wales, is now in custody at Melbourne under the name Joseph Yates and is charged with shop breaking. In the Australasian Sketcher with Pen and Pencil on Saturday the 23rd of April 1881, an article titled Daring Burglary. A daring burglary was perpetrated between 9 o'clock on Saturday night, April the 2nd, and 8 o'clock on the following evening on the premises of Mr. J. R. Webster, watchmaker and jeweller of 103 Swanston Street, Melbourne. The shop was, Mr. Webster states, securely fastened up on Saturday night, and the gas enabling the watchman to survey the interior of the shop was left burning as usual. Nothing unusual was observed until the next evening, when Mr. George Humphreys, an assistant for many years in Mr. Webster's employ, on his way home stayed to examine the locks and to see that everything was safe. On feeling for the padlock securing the outer shutters, he found that it was gone and that the locks of the entrance wicket had been prized off. He at once went for the police, and on the premises being entered, it was found that a burglary, cleverly conceived, had been coolly carried out. Having obtained an entrance to the outer door of the shop, the burglars had called tools well adapted for the work into requisition and had cut out a panel of the door, which was a solid wooden one, communicating with the window. The opening so made was, however, necessarily small, and a boy must have been employed in the work. The burglars removed the major portion of the goods in the window, comprising of 40 silver watches, 15 gold watches, and a great number of heavy gold Albert chains, ladies' fancy rings, gentlemen's signet rings, gold breastpins, charms, pendants, and other jewellery, valued in the aggregate between £800 and £1,000. A few days after the burglary, detectives O'Callaghan and Nixon succeeded in arresting 3 men on suspicion of being concerned in the robbery. On the 8th of April, the house of a well-known offender named Frederick J. Watson in Franklin Street, West Melbourne, who describes himself as a hawker, was visited, and Watson, who had only recently been discharged from Pentridge, was arrested. In his possession were found 2 gold watches and some other articles forming portion of the proceeds of the burglary, and in his backyard, Detective Nixon found 3 housebreaking implements, one of which, known as a jimmy, fits the marks made upon the door of Mr. Webster's shop. From further information, a man named Thomas Carter, a bootmaker residing at Collingwood, was arrested, and in his possession were found 2 more of the stolen watches. The same night, a third offender named Alfred Raingill, alias Joseph Yates, who lived with the prisoner Watson, was arrested on the charge of being concerned in the disposal of stolen goods. It's a significant fact that in his possession was found a sharp knife of a peculiar shape, with which there is little doubt the panel of the door of the shop was cut out. The burglars had evidently some difficulty in disposing of a portion of their booty, and the detectives, having reason to believe that some of it had been put away by being sunk in the Yarra, search was made with a view of discovering it. Detective Ward, who's an expert swimmer, dived into the river at the spot of which it was supposed some of the plunder was hidden, and his efforts were rewarded by the recovery of 5 silver watches and a few other articles, which were stolen from Mr. Webster's shop. More of the property was afterwards recovered in a similar way. The 3 prisoners were removed to the City Watch House. Watson is an accomplished thief and is well known. Carter is supposed to have been a criminal in one of the other colonies, and Yates is known to have been previously convicted. Raingill, under Joseph Yates, was jailed for 5 years with hard labour on the 1st of June 1881, and he was jailed at Pentridge, and he was released on the 28th of February 1885. In the Argus on the 9th of June 1885. The Simpsons Road Bank Robbery. The 5 men, Thomas Millage, Thomas McMahon, John Elcott, alias Cansey, George Fortune and Alfred Raingill, alias Yates, were arrested by Detectives Ward, Considine, Lovey and Causey on Saturday evening and Sunday morning on charges of vagrancy, and were yesterday seen in the watch house by the principal witnesses in the case of the sticking up of the Simpsons Road Bank, with the result that the Reverend J.A. Stewart identified Millage and Caney as 2 of the men who he saw leaving the bank premises soon after the robbery. Galley, a carrier, who was resting his horse in Shelley Street about 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, identified Yates as the man who was in the cart in which the robbers drove off. Gorey, a young lamplighter whose father informed the police that he'd seen the men in the cart on Lincoln Street, recognised all the prisoners but McMahon as the man who passed him in the cart. Thomas Carswell, Mr. J. Nation's gardener, who saw the prisoners cross Simpson's paddock at Kew, identified Yates as the driver of the cart, but would not speak definitely with regard to the others, as they were a considerable distance from him and were out of the cart before his suspicions as to their actions were aroused. A young woman employed as a barmaid at the Prince Patrick Hotel, Victoria Street, Collingwood, whose name the police think it's advisable not to divulge at present, identified McMahon, the companion of the others whom she had seen standing in Studley Park about noon on the day of the robbery. The witness galley furnished the detectives with a minute description of the cart used by the prisoners and stated that his curiosity was aroused when he saw several men getting into it near the bank, and he was going towards it to see what they had in it when they drove hurriedly away. Gorey stated that he was standing in Lincoln Street about 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning when the horse and cart, which were found by detectives Ward and Lovey in McMahon's yard, and which he identified, came along at a rapid pace, driven by Yates, who was accompanied by the prisoners Alcott, Fortune and Millage. The cart was swaying from side to side, and he expected every moment that it would capsize, and when it turned the next corner, he went down quickly to see if it had done so. Although a very short time had elapsed between their turning the corner and his coming in sight of Cross Street, they disappeared. As the car passed him, its occupants had their handkerchiefs up on their faces, and that prevented him from recognising them. He had known them previously. When the prisoners were taken before the bench, Sub-Inspector Deasy explained that although they were charged with vagrancy, they were strongly suspected of having been concerned in the sticking up of the Simpsons Road branch of the National Bank. Mr. J. Stewart was present to represent the bank and offered to assist in the prosecution, but as it was intended to apply for the remand of the prisoners, his offer was courteously declined. Fisher, Daly and Kane appeared for the prisoners, and as no evidence was given, they were merely asked that their clients should be admitted to bail if the bench decided to remand them. The detectives opposed the application, and it was refused. On information obtained from a private source yesterday morning, Inspector Kennedy and Detectives Ward, Considine and Lovey went to a spot in Studley Park not far from where the moneybags were found, and there in a hole from a foot to 18 inches in depth, and which appeared to have been dug with a pocket knife, they found £204 in National Bank notes, tied up in a handkerchief, and two other holes about a mile distant, where silver to the amount of nearly £50 also tied up in handkerchiefs. On the strength of the identification of the prisoners, they were yesterday afternoon charged with robbery under arms, and McMahon was charged with having aided and abetted them. The accused were taken before Mr. Carl PM and remanded to appear in the City Court on Tuesday. Dunleavy, who was arrested on Sunday night in Collingwood for complicity, was seen at Richmond yesterday and identified by Mr. Stewart as the man who, when he was passing the bank on Wednesday morning, left the two others and went to the middle of Shelley Street. Peter Lilburn, who saw the cart with the robbers passing along River Street, identified the prisoner Dunleavy also. Sergeant Bell discovered that the coat which Dunleavy was wearing when arrested was of the same material as the vest which had been found in Simpson's paddock queue. Dunleavy was taken before the Richmond bench yesterday and remanded until Saturday. The black trackers, who rendered valuable assistance in connecting the prisoners seen by Carswell in queue with the spot where the bags were found, will return to Dandenong this morning. The detectives believe that Alcott, Fortune and Millage stuck the bank up, and Yates drove them away afterwards. McMahon is believed to have met the others at Studley Park and driven the cart home to his place at Port Melbourne while they returned on foot. And on the 21st of July 1885, there's a further article on the Simpsons Road bank robbery, the prisoners in the criminal court. When the court resumed this afternoon after the adjournment, Alfred Raingill, alias Yates, continued his evidence. The prisoners were not wanting his friends or sympathisers among the spectators who crowded the court, and immediately after they took up their former places in the dock, a slight, almost inarticulate whisper was heard from the parties of the public gallery at the back of Millage. It was evidently heard and understood by some of the prisoners. Alcott turned his head, looked up and smiled to a little knot of men ranged on the front seat of the gallery. Millage next looked up and made a semi-comic, semi-despondent grimace. A minute or so later, Fortune followed suit, and after taking a good look at the cherubs aloft, answered their sympathetic glances with a deprecating smile. It should have been mentioned that when Raingill, before the adjournment, entered the witness box, Alcock's face turned a livid hue, and it remained so during the informer's examination. Otherwise, Alcock's face gave less indication of any feeling in regard to Rainhill than either Millage or Fortune. Raingill gave his evidence in a clear voice and without hesitation. It was evident from the language and the manner of his statement that, though a man of considerable intelligence, he was not well educated, and he showed a larrikin contempt for the rules. He detailed the arrangement made by Millage, Casey, Fortune and himself for effecting the robbery of the bank, and described how he was left out of the actual committal of the crime by drawing of the lots, which revealed in the 3 other men being selected for the deed. He narrated that according to the agreement, he waited with McMahon's horse and cart in the vicinity of the bank on the morning of the 3rd of June, and on his 3 confederates coming out with their plunder, he took them up and drove them away into Bridge Street, Richmond, where they were picked up by McMahon and drove to Studley Park. As the witness proceeded, Millage listened with hard-set features, and Alcock with a curious expression of countenance. When he spoke of McMahon's part in the affair, the half-caste looked up from his papers but gave no indication of feeling. As the informer was describing the division of money by Millage in Studley Park, Fortune turned his head and exchanged meaning glances with his friends in the gallery. Again, when the witness mentioned that a £10 note was reserved by Millage for the dealer Parker, Fortune looked up again at the sympathisers in the gallery. There was a contemptuous look on his face, and when he turned, he made a silent comment to the galley. He described how the 4 principals divided the loot up in Studley Park. He was asked if it was honestly divided, and he answered, "Well, I expect it was honestly divided." The informer's narrative was throughout substantially identical to that given by him at the police court. There was a funny little scene when he asked to identify the knife and the piece of burnt cork found in the waistcoat discovered in a culvert in Studley Park. He identified the knife at once belonging to Alcock, and so that he saw Alcock and Fortune on the night before the robbery blackening their moustaches with a piece of burnt cork. At this statement, Alcock and Fortune seemed much amused, while Millage enjoyed a hearty laugh and bent down his head in order that his continued hilarity might not be generally observed. Mr. McDermott commenced his cross-examination with the intention of endeavouring to get the informer to convict himself of being one of the 3 men who actually robbed the bank. "You know the upper steps at the bank premises?" he asked, and Raingill was not to be caught and replied quietly, "No, I don't." "Have you been in the bank and know its construction inside?" And he answered, "I was never in the bank. I have no idea of the construction inside the bank at all." "You swear you were never in the bank?" He said, "Yes." "You never looked into it?" "No." "You belong to the criminal class?" And he said, "Well, I suppose so." And he said, "Would you not have stopped at murder?" He said, "It would not have been murder if he had shot me." And the judge then stopped and said, "What is the object of these questions?" And Mr. McDermott said, "To show this man as an accumulation of villains, a murderer, a robber and a villain." The Reverend Stewart was the next witness and swore to the best of his belief that Millage, Alcock and Fortune were the 3 men whom he saw leave the bank premises by the side gate on the morning of the robbery and got into the cart which was driven by Raingill. There are about a dozen more witnesses to be called for the Crown, but their examination will not occupy as much time of those called today. So, as it quite clearly stated there, Alfred Raingill decided that he was going to change into being an informant, so he was not going to be jailed for this crime. Now, as a result, Alfred Raingill got out of Melbourne quite quickly. You could imagine what the payback would have been if he stuck around in Melbourne. So, on May the 25th, 1886, he was found in Sydney and he was charged with stealing, and he got 3 years hard labour. On December the 10th, 1888, he was again charged in Sydney with false pretences and served 18 months. On the 4th of August 1890, he was convicted of being in possession and uttering counterfeit coins and got 3 years hard labour. On the 31st of July 1893, he was convicted of uttering counterfeit coins and having counterfeit coins in his possession, and he received a total of 7.5 years jail with 3 years of those hard labour. And it was recorded in his jail record that on the 26th of May 1897 that he'd attempted suicide. He got his jail photo on the 27th of July 1897 and was released in May 1902. Only 2 months after his release, on the 21st of July 1902, it was reported of a death of a constable in Sydney. Marr's account of the affair, an unprovoked crime, murderers fired without speaking. Seen in the hospital, Constable Marr gave the following account of the terrible events of the previous night. "It was 10 minutes to 9 o'clock when I met Guilfoyle. I was walking home to Albert Street near the police station where my lodgings are, and we met at the corner of Calder Road and Ivy Street. Guilfoyle was on duty and in uniform. I was in my ordinary clothes. Seeing him talking to a number of people, I walked over to see what was the matter, for I judged from their appearance that something was wrong. He told me the two men had been into the grocer's shop on the corner only a few minutes before, passing spurious coins. "Come along here," he said, "and see if we can get them." The two of us then walked along Calder Road. When we got near the corner of Shepherd Street, we saw two men in overcoats. Guilfoyle said, "That's them," and I replied, "All right, you get one and I'll get the other." At the time, we were probably 20 yards behind them. We walked quickly up, and hearing our footsteps, they turned round. One fellow stood on the side of the footpath nearest the fence, and the other took a few steps over towards the curbstone, a little further away from us. As we came up to where the first fellow was, Guilfoyle said to him, "What's your name?" He said, "Wilson," and as he made the reply, I stepped towards his companion. A moment afterwards, I saw my man pulling something out from his pocket, and I was conscious that the man I was passing had made a similar movement. They didn't say anything, but commenced shooting at once. The man I was trying to arrest didn't say anything at all, and all the other man said was the one word, "Wilson." I don't know which one of them fired first. They both seemed to let go at once. I had no time to get to my man, who was 2 or 3 yards away from me, before I was shot through the right arm. I slipped and fell and was trying to get up when I got another one in the back. I could hear other shots behind me at the same time from the man that Guilfoyle had approached. As I was on my hands and knees trying to get up again, I got a third bullet which grazed my chin, and I'm pretty certain that he fired a fourth one at me which missed. The shots came very quickly after one another. For a second or two I was dazed, and when I tried to pull myself together, I saw the fellows running away up Shepherd Street. They were then 20 yards away. I wasn't equal to running after them. I saw Guilfoyle lying there, and I staggered to a house across the street and asked a young fellow who came to the door if he would go to the police station and let them know that 2 policemen were shot, telling him that I was a constable myself. I don't know whether there were any actual witnesses to the shooting. Some youngsters were following us up just before, but Guilfoyle told them to stay back, and whether they came any further or not, I don't know. Somebody got me a chair to sit on, and about 10 minutes afterwards, Constable Devlin got a cab and brought me to the hospital. Under the circumstances, I think that I'm very lucky to have escaped with a few scratches I got. I was quite at their mercy, for I was entirely unarmed. In fact, I hadn't got so much as a penknife on me. Ma, who is a tall and powerfully built young fellow of 24 years, is a native of Sydney and has only been in the force for the past 5 months. He served the usual probationary course at the barracks and depot, and in April last was drafted to Redfern. He's a single man and his father resides at Annandale. There could be no more eloquent testimony of the extreme narrowness of the wearer's escape. It is little short of wonderful that the murder of 2 constables had not to be reported instead of 1. In the Tenterfield Intercolonial Courier and Fairfield and Warringara Advocate on the 22nd of July 1902, the latest on the information says no trace of the murderers, a reward offered. No trace of Constable Guilfoyle's murderers have yet to be obtained. An inquest was opened this morning on the body of Guilfoyle, but after formal evidence of identification was taken, the inquiry was adjourned. The government have offered a reward of £200 for the arrest of the murderers. It is reported that a big find of spurious coins has been made in a schoolyard in one of the suburbs. In the Scone Advocate on the 25th of July 1902, there's an article stating Guilfoyle's murderers, 1 shot and another arrested. 1 man was shot dead and another arrested near Queanbeyan, both of whom are supposed to be Constable Guilfoyle's murderers. The Inspector General of Police received a telegram this morning from Ginadera, near Queanbeyan, stating that Constable Madden, hearing that 2 strangers had arrived in the district, set out in pursuit, accompanied by 2 civilians, and found the men in question, whose description tallied with that of the suspects of Guilfoyle's murder. The constable immediately approached them with a revolver in his hand, calling upon them to surrender. One of the men rose quickly and grasped for his rifle, the constable simultaneously making a grab at the rifle when his revolver exploded. Another shot was also fired in the vicinity. One of the men fell dead and the other was then secured. Neither of the civilians had fired. The body of the dead man was examined and marks were found identical with those known to exist on the man suspected of the murder. The deceased was apparently 35 to 40 years of age. Police and officials have little doubt that the captured men are those suspected of Guilfoyle's murder, but the search through the city and suburbs is still being continued. However, on Monday, the 28th of July 1902, the Grafton Argus and Clarence River General Advertiser headlines an article titled "A Terrible Mistake, an innocent man shot by police." A terrible mistake has been made by the Queanbeyan police. Constable Madden yesterday shot an innocent man dead, the constable at the time being under the impression that the man was one of Constable Guilfoyle's murderers. At first there was little doubt as to the men being those who were required, but when the Sydney detectives arrived at Queanbeyan this morning and viewed the body of the dead man and saw his companion, they expressed very grave doubts as to whether the right man had been shot. The arrested man gave his name as John Nichols Jr. of Cooma. He stated his father was a tinsmith at Cooma. These facts have been positively established, and there is no doubt he had nothing to do with the Redford tragedy. As regards to his companion, he asserts that he never knew his name. They were travelling together and came from Queanbeyan from Tumut. On Saturday last, the day of the tragedy, they were together in Yass. The police expressed the opinion that the story told by Nichols is genuine. A later telegram states that all doubt has now been set at rest and the man shot at Queanbeyan was an innocent traveller. Who he was has not been satisfactorily established, but the police believe his name was Heap. The Sydney detectives state they feel satisfied that the real murderers are still in the neighbourhood of Epping. In the Maitland Daily Mercury on the 30th of July 1902, in Sydney, the murderers at large, a notification was issued today increasing the reward for the arrest of Constable Guilfoyle's murderers to £400. In the Dubbo Liberal and Macquarie Advocate on the 23rd of July 1902, it states the fatal shooting case. The police consider they have established beyond a doubt the identity of the men who shot Constables Guilfoyle and Marr on Saturday night. Constable Guilfoyle's murderers have been traced by the police to the vicinity of the Hawkesbury railway station, and it is presumed that they walked from Sydney to the place where they were seen and will make across country. On the 13th of October 1902, there was a small article that stated, "Who is the murderer?" Inspector Causey believes that not only that the murderer is George Shaw, the Sydney criminal, but that he is identical with Joseph Yates, alias Raingill, with three others, was concerned with sticking up a bank in Simpsons Road, Collingwood. Yates escaped punishment at the time by turning Queen's evidence. One of the men who was punished was Buck Millage, who was subsequently hanged in Sydney for murderously wounding a police constable. And in the Daily Mirror in Sydney on the 4th of February 1952, there was a recollection of what occurred with Raingill. Raingill had turned Queen evidence in a famous bank robbery in the 80s. Threatened with the vengeance of the two men who were convicted on his evidence, Raingill fled the country and had long been forgotten by Victoria Police. The two men who he had shelved belonged to the elite of the underworld during the 80s and 90s. Their record as top-class burglars, assault and robbery experts, garroters and standover men, whose victims were mostly well-known bookmakers, is still unequalled in Australian criminal history. They were Buck Millage and Tiger McMahon. Many years after the squealer, Raingill, turned them in for the early bank robbery, they were hanged in Darlinghurst Jail under the names Montgomery and Williams. So it is not a matter of wonder that Mr. Raingill promptly departed for parts unknown after helping to jail such a redoubtable pair of desperados. In the Sydney Morning Herald on Monday the 20th of October 1902, there's a heading in an article stating Constable Guilfoyle's murderer. The identification of the murderer of Constable Johnson in Melbourne as the long-wanted murderer of Constable Guilfoyle in Sydney closes a disagreeable chapter in the history of crime in Australia. It is satisfactory to learn that a desperate criminal who killed two constables and was indirectly the cause of the death of the unfortunate hawker Heaps is now safely out of the way. The community has no use for such a dangerous man whose record forbade any justifiable hope of reformation, even if his life had not already been forfeited to the law. False to his companions in crime, the wretched man seemed to be ready to turn his hand to any kind of crime, whether it has to do with uttering base coin, robbing a bank or assaulting children. He valued life at so low a figure that he even attempted his own, and as we have seen, he actually took the lives of two men who, in the exercise of their duty, sought to arrest him. The identification would seem to be complete. The personal characteristics of the murderer of Constable Guilfoyle were found on the body of the murderer of Constable Johnson. There was also similarity in the nature of the crimes, and there was the fact that no identification was forthcoming in Melbourne. Though satisfaction will be felt at the news of the identification, there is little room for congratulating the Melbourne police authorities. The incessant efforts to trace and arrest Shaw and his accomplices in Sydney were completely baffled. Policemen and detectives were hunting for the criminals in Sydney, whilst it would appear one at least of the men had succeeded in evading the search and made themselves conspicuous in Melbourne. The Kalgoorlie Miner in Western Australia reported on the 25th of October 1902 from Melbourne the St Kilda tragedy magisterial inquiry. The circumstances of the murder of Constable Richard Johnston and the suicide of his assassin George Shaw, alias Yates, alias Raingill, were investigated today. John Mackenzie, Deputy Governor of the Darlinghurst Jail, identified the body of the murderer as that of George Shaw. The witness last saw George alive on the 8th of May when he was liberated from prison. During conversation in prison with Shaw, the latter had said that no policeman would take him but for grog. Frederick W. Huntley, overseer at works at Maitland Jail, also identified the body of that of Shaw, who had been under his control on the morning of his discharge. He was greatly upset because the jail governor had not given him a railway pass. The witness said that the governor would give it to him at the railway station, and he replied, "That means I am going to be shadowed right into Sydney. If I am, God help the man that tries to arrest me." Henry Elliott, 15 years of age, residing at Windsor, said that he was riding along with Constable Johnston when the latter was shot. The witness overtook Johnston and spoke to him about the weather. Johnston said, "That is a heavy machine you are riding." Just as he finished speaking, the witness heard a shot fired and saw a man on the footpath holding a smoking revolver in his hand. The coroner commented on the heroism of Constable Yodam and Wilson. The jury found that Constable Johnston died from a bullet wound inflicted by George Shaw, who, with the same revolver, shot himself. In the Ovens and Murray Advertiser in Beechworth on the 25th of October 1902, they also reported the incident. It says a St Kilda murderer recognised as Shaw and Raingill. The police have now evidence which almost amounts to positive proof, not only that the murderer of Constable Johnston is identical with George Shaw, who shot Constable Guilfoyle in Sydney on the 19th of July, but he is the same man who, under the name of Yates and Raingill, served several sentences in Victoria prior to his various terms of imprisonment in New South Wales. This conclusion has been arrived at not only on the word of Mr Mackenzie, Deputy Governor of Darlinghurst Jail. Mr Mackenzie's statement has been backed up by two other persons, one who claims to be Shaw's sister, which as an aside isn't possible, so I'm not sure who this female was that came forward. I've researched into Alfred Raingill's family, and he did have three sisters. Two of them were deceased by the time this event took place, and the other sister, without a doubt, married and lived in England. While the other saw him on the day before the murder of Constable Guilfoyle and has the best reasons for asserting that the body, which was lying at the morgue, is that of Shaw. Mr Mackenzie arrived in Melbourne by Sydney Express on Saturday. He made his examination of the corpse the same afternoon, and his conclusion totally different from that which Constable Mitchell arrived at, inasmuch he is certain that the murderer of Constable Johnston and the murderer of Constable Guilfoyle are one and the same person. On reaching the morgue, Mr Mackenzie was shown the body by Sergeant Davidson. A previous offer to show him photographs of Shaw and provide him with a full list of marks and scars, which has been kept at the detective office, was waved aside. "I don't want to see any photographs or scars. I know Shaw perfectly well, and if this is the man, I will recognise him. Nothing you could show me could in the slightest degree add or take from my conviction that he is Shaw. It is not a matter of believing. I know he is the man." Putting on a pair of spectacles, Mr Mackenzie looked at the body for a moment and then remarked, "Can you prop it up in a sitting posture?" This was done, and after another earnest look at the face of the corpse, which was wonderfully well preserved, Mr Mackenzie exclaimed, "The man is Shaw. There is nothing more certain than that." And in the Adelaide Observer, South Australia, on the 1st of November 1902, it recalls the career of Raingill. A criminal's career, Melbourne. At the inquest today concerning the deaths of Constable Richard Johnston and George Shaw, alias Raingill, alias Yates, interesting evidence was given by Mr John Mackenzie, Deputy Governor of Darlinghurst Jail, and Mr Frederick William Humphrey, Overseer of Works at Maitland Jail. The former said the last time he saw Shaw was on the 8th of May at the East Maitland Railway Station when he handed Shaw his railway ticket for Sydney. During the 2 months prior to this date, he saw a good deal of the man and frequently had long conversations with him. He remembered saying to him, "You've had a very long stretch of jail life. Now don't you think you could try and do something better?" Shaw said, "Yes, I don't think I'll ever get into trouble again. If it is not for the grog, no policeman will ever take me." On another occasion, he made a request to be allowed to wear in jail the boots that were to be supplied to him after discharge in order that they might get into the shape of his feet, as he had awkward feet and cramped toes, which would be hurt by walking in new boots after his discharge. On another occasion, he asked the witness to draw his money from the savings bank so he could have cash on the morning of his discharge, as he did not want to be staying about Sydney, waiting for money for 2 or 3 days. He had £5 or £6, which he had when arrested. Mr Mackenzie went on to say that Shaw was in Parramatta Jail on the 11th of May 1898 and applied to be placed on special treatment for protection, as he complained that his life was in danger. He'd turned Queen's evidence regarding the Simpsons Road bank robbery in Melbourne in 1885. This was known among the men in jail, and stones were thrown at him. The man was removed to Parramatta Jail from Mudgee in 1897 for the same reason, and in 1894 was separated from other prisoners in Bathurst Jail. The application for protection was strengthened by a jail memorandum. The prisoner has always had a good character in jail and has never had a black or idle mark. In reply to a question, Mr Mackenzie said he knew nothing of Shaw's movements subsequent to the 8th of May. He was satisfied that Constable Mitchell, who came to Melbourne to identify the body, did not know Shaw and therefore was quite incapable of identifying him. Mr Frederick William Humphrey identified the body of Johnston's murderer of that of Shaw, who on the 8th of May last was a prisoner in Maitland Jail. He'd been under the witness's supervision for 4 years and had told the witness he was an English criminal, that he had broken jail, and he was shot in the left knee while trying to get away. He also said he was known to the Victorian Police as Raingill, that he was connected with the Simpsons Road bank robbery, that it was a matter of going up or his mates, and that he thought it was better for his mates to go than for him. On the morning of his discharge, the witness saw him on Morpeth Road, Maitland. He was then very much put out because the governor would not give him a railway pass. Shaw said, "I am going to meet him at the railway station. I know what that means. I am going to be shadowed right into Sydney, and if I am, God help the man who tries to arrest me." The witness replied, "That's all nonsense. We only want to get you out of this district and make sure you are going." That was the last he saw of Shaw. The man was wearing his beard, as it is at present, and the witness had no doubt about his identity. The jury returned the following verdict: that on the 12th of October at St Kilda, Richard Johnston died from hemorrhage from a bullet wound inflicted maliciously by George Shaw, and George Shaw died from a bullet wound in the brain inflicted by himself with the intent to commit suicide. We find that Richard Johnston died while in the execution of his duty. So what led Raingill to make that decision that he decided to end his life after shooting the policeman? Well, my theory is that he had seen his 2 confederates from the robbery follow that path and ended up being hung. I think he had decided at that point, by shooting that policeman, he wasn't going to be jailed any further or hung, and was going to end it there. So a life of criminality for Alfred Henry Bisset Raingill.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.